Good evening and welcome back to my channel. I am your loyal Hufflepuff, and today I am proudly excited to announce this will be our first book in a kids series, and I will be reading it to you guys. This is titled Flora and Ulysses by Kate DiCamillo. DiCamillo. I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name, but this is a book, and there is a Disney Plus film original out there that is based off the same book, and there are some illustrations in here. They are very cute. I've read it once before, and it is. I do like this book. It's really nice, really cute. I'm looking forward to reading this to you guys. This is my first kids book, and I hope you all enjoy it like I did. So let's go ahead and start reading Flora and Ulysses. Flora Bell Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. Flora, her mother shouted, "What are you doing up there?" "I'm reading," Flora shouted back. "Remember the contract," her mother shouted. "Do not forget the contract." At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced, and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. "I hate romance," said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words. Hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. "Yep," thought Flora, "that's me." She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing Incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickham's backyard. "What the heck?" said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickham running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. "That can't be," thought Flora. "Who vacuums their yard?" Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickham knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. "A few bolts shy of a load," said Flora out loud, and then she saw that Mrs. Tickham and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. "Hey now," said Flora. She banged on the window. "Watch out!" she shouted. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." There is just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel"? It didn't make any difference, though. What word she said. Flora was too far away. That vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. The malfeasance This malfeasance must be stopped, said Flora in a deep and superheroic voice. This malfeasance must be stopped, was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing Incandesto and became a towering crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Flump! Holy bagoomba, said Flora. That's the end of chapter 1. And now we do chapter 2. These chapters are very short, so just to give you a heads up, if you guys are enjoying this, please comment down below, and we'll get started with chapter 2. And like I said, these chapters are very, 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 very short. Not much goes on in the mind of the squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over one thought: food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. Where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickham's backyard got swallowed up by Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, "Here, at last, is my fate come to meet me." He did not think, "Oh, please give me one more chance, and I will be good." What he thought was, "Man, I sure am hungry." And then there was a terrible roar, and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in his squirrel head, not even thoughts of food. End of chapter 2. Beginning of chapter 3. Seemingly, swallowing a squirrel was a bit much even for the powerful, indomitable, outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickham bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickham. "What next?" She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. "Help," she said. "I think I've killed a squirrel." End of chapter 3. Beginning of chapter 4. Let me take a quick look. Wow. Okay. Yep. We're going to keep on going. Chapter 4. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, "For a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person." She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, "Where are you going, Flora Belle?" Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickhams in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook it harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a flop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur, vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell and rose again. and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. And I'll show you a picture right here. That's her trying to revive the squirrel, or trying to make sure the squirrel is alive. So let's keep on reading. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible things can happen to you. Detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What do you do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended? Run! Locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible things can happen to you did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out, said Mrs. Tickum. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel. Fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. Have you lost your mind? Said Mrs. Tickum. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. End of chapter 4. Now there's one thing I learned about CPR, and that is to make sure the area was secured and safe. And that is not what happens in this book. Obviously, she's a child, so she doesn't have CPR training. She knows about it. I'm pretty sure she's learned some CPR, but she doesn't know the procedures when it comes to CPR. So, I find it very interesting. But let us continue reading. Chapter 5. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone black. And then, into this black blankness, there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. What's that? Said the squirrel. A light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. Okay, said the squirrel. You bet. He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. The voice was counting. The light receded. Breathe, the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. End of chapter 5. Beginning of chapter 6. Well, he's breathing, said Mrs. Tickum. Yes, said Flora, he is. She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickum, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way, or stabilizing it with a stick, or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically, and Florabelle Buckman started looking around the Tickerman's backyard for a stick. End of chapter 6. Beginning of chapter 7. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. And there's some pictures of the squirrel. And right here. So let's take a look at some pictures right here. Some more of the squirrel. Kind of funny. It says up in the corner there, who can say what astonishments are hidden inside the most mundane being? So, that's the squirrel picking up the vacuum cleaner, which is kind of funny. So let's go ahead and keep on reading. We're doing good. We're on chapter 8 now. Flora and Mrs. Tickum noticed at the same time. "The squirrel," said Flora. "The vacuum cleaner," said Mrs. Tickum. Together they stared at the Ulysses 2000 and at the squirrel, who was holding it over his head with one paw. "That can't be," said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel shook the vacuum cleaner. "That can't be," said Mrs. Tickum. "You already said that," said Flora. "I'm repeating myself?" "You're repeating yourself." "Maybe I have a brain tumor," said Mrs. Tickum. It was certainly possible that Mrs. Tickum had a brain tumor. Flora knew from reading Terrible Things Can Happen to You that a surprising number of people were walking around with tumors in their brains and didn't even know it. That was the thing about tragedy. It was just sitting there, keeping you company, waiting, and you had absolutely no idea. This was the kind of helpful information you could get from the comics if you paid attention. The other kind of information that you absorbed from the regular reading of comics was particularly from the regular reading of the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto. Was that impossible things happened all the time? For instance, heroes, superheroes, were born of ridiculous and unlikely circumstances. Spider bites, chemical spills, planetary dislocation, and in the case of Alfred T. Slipper, from accidental submersion in an industrial-sized vat of cleaning solution called Incandesto, the cleaning professional's hard-working friend. "I don't think you have a brain tumor," said Flora. "There might be another explanation." "Uh-huh," said Mrs. Tickum. What's the other explanation?" "Have you ever heard of Incandesto?" "What?" said Mrs. Tickum. "Who?" said Flora. "Incandesto is a who. He's a superhero." "Right," said Mrs. Tickum. "And your point is?" Flora raised her right hand. She pointed with a single finger at the squirrel. "Surely you're not implying," said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel lowered the vacuum cleaner to the ground. He held himself very still. He considered both of them. His whiskers twitched and trembled. There were cracker crumbs on his head. He was a squirrel. Could he be a superhero too? Alfred T. Slipper was a janitor. Most of the time, people looked right past him. Sometimes, often in fact, they treated him with disdain. They had no idea of the astonishing acts of heroism, the blinding light, contained within his outward humdrum disguise. Only Alfred's parakeet, Dolores, knew who he was and what he could do. "The world will misunderstand him," said Flora. "You bet it will," said Mrs. Tickum. "Tootie!" shouted Mrs. Tickum from the back door. "Tootie, I'm hungry." Tootie? What a ridiculous name. Flora couldn't resist the urge to say it out loud. "Tootie," she said. "Tootie Tickum. Listen, Tootie. Go inside. Feed your husband. Say something to him or to anyone else about any of this." Oh, say nothing to him or to anyone else about any of this. Right, said Tootie. Say nothing. Feed my husband. Okay, right. She began walking slowly toward the house. Mr. Tickham called out, Are you done vacuuming? What about the Ulysses? Are you are you just going to leave it sitting there? Ulysses, whispered Flora. She felt a shiver run from the back of her head to the base of her spine. She might be a natural born cynic, but she knew the right word when she heard it. Ulysses, she said again. She bent down and held out a hand to the squirrel. Come here, Ulysses, she said. End of chapter 7. No, sorry, chapter 8. End of chapter 8. Beginning of chapter 9. There are 68 chapters in this book, by the way. And that's why I'm saying they are very, very, very short. So, just giving you a heads up, we will be reading a good number of chapters tonight. And I'm hoping I'm not boring you with all these chapters, because there are a lot. Chapter 9. She spoke to him, and he understood her. What the girl said was, Ulysses, come here, Ulysses. And without thinking, he moved toward her. It's okay, she said, and he believed her. It was astonishing. Everything was astonishing. The setting sun was illuminating each blade of grass. It was reflecting off the girl's glasses, making a halo of light around the girl's round head, setting the whole world on fire. The squirrel thought, when did things become so beautiful? And if it has been this way all along, how is it that I never noticed before? Listen to me, the girl said. My name is Flora. Your name is Ulysses. Okay, thought the squirrel. She put her hand on him. She picked him up. She cradled him in her left arm. He felt nothing but happiness. Why had he always been so terrified of humans? Why had he always been so terrified of humans? He couldn't imagine. Actually, he could imagine. And we'll have a little picture of, you see Flora and Ulysses right there, holding the little squirrel like a baby. So cute. There had been that time when, with the boy and the BB gun, there had truthfully been a lot of incidents with humans, some involving BB guns, some not, and all of them had been violent, terrifying, and soul-destroying. But this was a new life, and he was a changed squirrel. He felt spectacular, strong, smart, capable, and also hungry. He was very, very hungry. End of chapter 9, and we begin chapter 10. Flora's mother was in the kitchen. She was typing. She wrote on an old typewriter, and when she pounded the keys, the kitchen table shook, and the plates on the shelves rattled, and the silverware in the drawers cried out in a metallic kind of alarm. Flora had decided that this was not part of the reason her parents had divorced. Not the noise of the writing, but the writing itself, specifically the writing of romance. Flora's father had said, I think that your mother is so in love with her books about love that she doesn't love me anymore. And her mother had said, Ha! Your father is so far off in left field that he wouldn't recognize love if it stood up in his soup and sang. Flora had a hard time imagining what love would be doing, standing in a bowl of soup and singing. But these were the kind of idiotic words her parents spoke, and they said the words to each other, even though they were pretending that they were talking to Flora. It was all very annoying. What are you doing? Her mother said to Flora. She was sucking on a pitzer pop. It made her words sound rocky and sharp-edged. Her mother used to smoke, and then she stopped. But she still had to have something in her mouth when she typed, so she consumed a lot of pitzer pops. This one was orange-flavored. Flora could smell it. Oh, nothing, said Flora. She glanced at the squirrel in her arms. Good, said her mother. She whacked the carriage. She whacked the carriage return on the typewriter without looking up. She was typing, "Are you still standing there?" Her mother said. She typed some more words. She hit the carriage return again. "I'm on a deadline here. It's hard to concentrate with you standing over me breathing like that." "I could stop breathing," said Flora. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," said her mother. "Go upstairs and wash your hands. We're going to eat soon." "Okay," said Flora. She walked past her mother and into the living room, still carrying Ulysses in the crook of her arm. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. She had smuggled a squirrel into the house, and she had done it right under her mother's nose, or behind her back, or something. In the living room, at the base of the stairs, the little shepherdess lamp was waiting, a pink-cheeked smirk plastered on her face. Flora hated the little shepherdess. Her mother had bought the lamp with her first royalty check from her first book, On Feathered Wings of Joy, which was the stupidest title for a book that Flora had ever heard in her life. And we'll go ahead and show you the picture right here of her mother typing in the kitchen and Flora and Ulysses right there in the back. And right there is the candies that she's sucking on. So that's her mother is enjoying with these lollipops. So I wonder what they would actually taste like, if they're like the Tootsie Pops that we see today, or if they're another kind. But with me imagining it, they do sound good. Her mother had sent away to London for the lamp. When it arrived, she unpacked it and plugged it in. And then she clapped her hands and said, "Oh, she's so beautiful. Isn't she beautiful? I love her with all my heart." Flora's mother never called Flora beautiful. She never said that she loved her with all her heart. Luckily, Flora was a cynic and didn't care whether her mother loved her or not. "I think that I will call her Marianne," her mother had said. "Marianne," said Flora. You're going to name a lamp?" "Marianne, shepherdess to the lost," said her mother. "Who's lost exactly?" said Flora. But her mother hadn't bothered to answer that question. "This," Flora said to the squirrel, "is the little shepherdess. Her name is Marianne. Unfortunately, she lives here, too." The squirrel considered Marianne. Flora narrowed her eyes and stared at the lamp. She knew that it was ridiculous, but sometimes she felt as if Marianne knew something she didn't know, that the little shepherdess was keeping some dark and terrible secret. "You stupid lamp," said Flora. Mind your own business. Mind your sheep." Actually, there was just one sheep. A tiny lamb, excuse me. A tiny lamb curled up at Marianne's pink, slippered feet. Flora always wanted to say to the little shepherdess, "If you're such a great shepherdess, where are the rest of your sheep, huh?" "We can just ignore her," said Flora to Ulysses. She turned away from the smug and glowing Marianne and climbed the stairs to her room, holding Ulysses carefully in her arms. He didn't glow, but he was surprisingly warm for someone so small. That is the end of chapter 10, and we'll be beginning chapter 11 shortly. I just need to get some water. Now there are 68 chapters in this book, and we are in chapter 11. So we are going through this book very quickly and at a good pace. So let's go ahead and keep going and see how far we get tonight. What time is it? Yeah, we got some time. She put Ulysses down on her bed, and he looked even smaller sitting there in the bright overhead light. He also looked pretty bald. "Good grief," said Flora. The squirrel certainly didn't look very heroic. But then, neither did Neither did the nearsighted, unassuming janitor, Alfred T. Slipper. Ulysses looked up at Flora, and then he looked down at his tail. He seemed unrelieved to see it. He lowered his nose and sniffed along the length of it. I'm hoping that you can understand me, said Flora. The squirrel raised his head. He stared at her. Wow, said Flora. Great. Okay. I can't understand you. And that's a small problem. But we'll figure out a way to communicate, okay? Nod at me if you understand what I'm saying. Like this. Flora nodded, and Ulysses nodded back. Flora's heart leaped up high in her chest. I'm going to try and explain what happened to you, okay? Ulysses nodded his head very fast. And again, Flora's heart leaped up high inside inside of her in a hopeful and extremely uncynical kind of way. She closed her eyes. Don't hope, she told her heart. Do not hope. Instead, observe. Do not hope. Instead, observe was a piece of advice that appeared in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. According to Terrible Things, hope sometimes got in the way of action. For instance, if you looked at your elderly Aunt Edith choking on a piece of steak from the all-you-can-eat buffet, and you told yourself, man, I sure hope she's not choking, you would waste several valuable life-saving Heimlich maneuver performing seconds. Do not hope. Instead, observe were words that Flora, as a cynic, had found useful in the extreme. She repeated them to herself a lot. Okay, said Flora. She opened her eyes. She looked at the squirrel. What happened is that you got vacuumed. And because you got vacuumed, you might have, powers. Ulysses gave a questioning look. Do you know what a superhero is? The squirrel continued to stare at her. Right, said Flora. Of course you don't. A superhero is someone with special powers, and he uses those powers to fight the forces of darkness and evil, like Alfred T. Slipper, who is also incandesto. Ulysses blinked several times in a nervous kind of way. We got another picture. Yes. This is a picture of Flora introducing Ulysses to Alfred T. Slipper in the comic books. So, yep, that's what that picture is. And we're going to continue reading. Look, said Flora. She grabbed the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto off her desk. She pointed at Alfred in his janitor uniform. See, she said, this is Alfred, and he is the unassuming, nearsighted, stuttering janitor who works cleaning the multi-floor offices of the Paxatucket Life Insurance Company. He lives a quiet life in his studio apartment with only his parakeet, Dolores, for company. Ulysses looked down at the picture of Alfred and then up at Flora. Okay, said Flora. So one day Alfred takes a tour of the Incandesto cleaning solution factory and he slips. Alfred T. Slipper. Get it? Into a gigantic vat of Incandesto. And it changes him. And so now, when there is a great crisis, when malfeasance is apparent, Alfred turns himself into... Flora flipped through the pages of the comic and stopped at the panel that showed the glowing, powerful Incandesto. Incandesto, she said. See? Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light, so painfully bright that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses. Flora realized that she was shouting the tiniest bit. She looked down at Ulysses. His eyes were enormous in his small face. Flora tried to sound calm, reasonable. She lowered her voice. As Incandesto, she said, Alfred sheds light into the darkest corners of the universe. He can fly. Also, he visits the elderly. And that's what a superhero is. And I think you might be one too. At least, I think you have powers. So far, all we know about you is that you're really strong. Ulysses nodded. He puffed out his chest. Flora! Her mother shouted. Get down here. Dinner's ready. But what else can you do? Said Flora to the squirrel. And if you truly are a superhero, how will you fight evil? Ulysses furrowed his brow. Flora bent down. She put her face close to his. Think about it, she said. Imagine what you might be able to do. Florabelle! Her mother shouted. I can hear you up there talking to yourself. You shouldn't talk to yourself. People will hear you and think you're strange. I'm not talking to myself, Flora shouted. Well then, with whom are you speaking? A squirrel! There was a long silence from down below, and then her mother shouted, That's not funny, Flora. Florabelle, get down here right now. End of chapter 11, and we begin chapter 12. When Flora came back up upstairs after dinner, she found Ulysses curled up in a tight little ball, sleeping on her pillow. She put out her hand and touched his forehead with one finger. His eyes twitched, but they didn't open. She picked up the pillow and moved it carefully to the foot of the bed. She changed into her pajamas, lay down, and imagined the words, a superhero squirrel rested at her feet, and so she was not lonely at all, emblazoned on the ceiling above her. That's exactly right, she said. Before the divorce, before her father had moved out of the house and into an apartment, he had often sat beside her at night and read aloud to her from the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto. It was his favorite book comic. It always cheered him up to read about Alfred T. Slipper and Dolores. Her father did an excellent parakeet imitation. Holy Bagumba, he would say in the voice of Dolores. Holy unanticipated occurrences. Holy unanticipated occurrences was what Dolores would say when something truly unexpected and unbelievable was happening, which was basically all the time. Life was pretty exciting when you were Incandesto's parakeet. Flora sat up and looked down at the sleeping squirrel. Holy unanticipated occurrences, she said. It sounded better when her father said it. Not that he's said it these days. He didn't say much of anything anymore. Her father had always been sad, quiet man. But since the divorce, he had become even sadder and quieter, which was fine with Flora. Really, cynics don't like a lot of chatter. Besides, Alfred T. Slipper was a quiet man, too. For instance, when he was on his tour of the Incandesto manufacturing facility and had fallen into the vat of Incandesto, he hadn't said a single word, not even oops. Words had appeared above his head, however, and Flora's father had read those words to her so many times that she could recite them by heart. He is an unassuming janitor, but he will dare to battle the darkness of the universe. Do you doubt him? Do not. Alfred T. Slipper will live to fight the forces of evil. He will become known to the world as Incandesto. Flora laid back down. If the squirrel were in a comic, she thought, what words would have appeared in the space over his head when he was sucked into the vacuum cleaner? He is an unassuming squirrel. Yep. But he will soon conquer villains of all stripes. He will defend the defenseless and protect the weak. That sounded good too. He'll become known to the world as Ulysses. Holy Bagumba, anything could happen. Together. She and Ulysses could change the world, or something. Do not hope. Instead, observe. Flora whispered to calm herself down. Just observe the squirrel. And then she fell asleep. End of chapter 12. Beginning of chapter 13. Excuse me as I readjust here a bit. All right. All right, we're at chapter 13. All right. All right, chapter 13. He woke in darkness. His heart was beating very fast. Something had happened. What was it? He couldn't think. He was too hungry to think. He sat up and looked around the room. He was in bed, and Flora's feet were in his face. She was snoring. He could see the outline of her round head. He loved that head. But man, he was hungry. The door to the bedroom was open. Ulysses got off the pillow and went out of the room. He crept along the dark hallway. He went down the stairs and past the little shepherdess. The house was dark, but there was a light in the kitchen. The kitchen! That was exactly where he needed to be. He put his nose up. He sniffed. He smelled something cheesy, wonderful. He ran through the living room and the dining room and into the kitchen. He climbed up on the counter, and there it was, a lone cheese puff, perched on the edge of the red formica countertop. He ate it. It was delicious. Maybe there was more cheese puffs. He opened a cabinet, and yes, there was a big bag with the beautiful word Cheese-O-Mania written in golden script on the front of it. He ate until the bag was empty, and then he burped softly, gratefully. He looked around the kitchen, and we have another picture. Another group of pictures of the squirrel in the kitchen. He's checking out the typewriter, seeing what he can do, and seeing what's there, what is the typewriter and what's it there for, and all that stuff. So let's see what's going on here. Oh, there's more. This part says, in the darkened kitchen, the unassuming squirrel worked slowly. His whiskers trembled. His heart sang. Was he fighting evil? Who could say? And here's the little squirrel. He did 2 letters. He's so happy. You see that? He's so happy. He's excited that he's typed out a couple letters. He's excited about it. And as you can see, we just finished chapter 13. We're at chapter 14 now. Flora Buckman, get down here right now. Don't call me Florabelle, Flora muttered. She opened her eyes. The room was bright with sunlight. She had been dreaming something wonderful. What was it? She had been dreaming about a squirrel. In her dream, he was flying with his legs straight out in front of him and his tail straight out behind him. He was a squirrel on his way to save someone. He looked supremely, magnificently heroic. Flora sat up and looked down at her feet. There was Ulysses, sleeping on the pillow, and he did look heroic. In fact, he was glowing, just like Incandesto, except oranger. He was extremely orange. What the heck? said Flora. She leaned over Ulysses and reached out a finger to touch his ear. She held the finger up to the light. Cheese! He was covered in cheese dust. Uh-oh, said Flora. Flora! Her mother shouted. I'm not kidding. Get down here right now. Flora went down the stairs and past Marianne, whose cheeks were glowing a healthy and disgusting pink. You stupid lamp, said Flora. Now, shouted Flora's mother. Flora broke into a trot. She found her mother standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe, staring at the typewriter. What's this? Her mother said. She pointed at the typewriter. That's your typewriter, said Flora. She knew that her mother was absent minded and preoccupied. But this was ridiculous. How could she not recognize her own typewriter? I know it's my typewriter, said her mother. I'm talking about the piece of paper in it. I'm talking about the words on the paper. Flora leaned forward. She squinted. She tried to make sense of the word typed at the top of the page. Squirrel. Squirrel, said Flora out loud. She felt she felt a surge of delight at the zip, idiocy of the word. It was almost as good a word as tutti. Keep reading, said her mother. Squirrel, said Flora again. I am Ulysses, born anew. Do you think that's funny? Said her mother. Not really, said Flora. Her heart was beating very fast in her chest. She felt dizzy. I have told you and told you to leave this typewriter alone, said her mother. I didn't, said Flora. What's going on here is a serious business, said her mother. I am a professional writer. I am under deadline for this novel. This is no time for hijinks. Plus, you ate a whole bag of cheese puffs. I did not, said Flora. Her mother pointed at the empty Cheezomania bag on the counter. And then she pointed at the typewriter. Flora's mother liked to point at things. You left cheese dust all over the typewriter. That's disrespectful. You simply cannot eat a whole bag of cheese puffs. It's not healthy. You'll become stout. I didn't, said Flora. But then another wave of dizziness came over her. The squirrel could type. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. I'm sorry, said Flora in a small voice. Well, said her mother. She raised her finger. She was obviously getting ready to point at something again. Fortunately, the doorbell rang. End of chapter 14. Yeah, we're at chapter 15. And it's not even an hour. And we're at chapter 15. All right, chapter 15. To say that the Buckman doorbell rang would be inaccurate. Something had happened to the bell. Its inner workings had become twisted, warped, confused, so that instead of emitting a pleasant ding or bong, the doorbell now sent an angry window shattering, you guessed the wrong answer on a game show kind of buzz through the Buckman house. To Flora, the doorbell sounded like the electric chair. Not that she had ever heard an electric chair, but she had read about electric chairs and terrible things can happen to you. That particular installment of the comic had not contained any advice other than it would be best to avoid getting to a place in your life where you might have to face the electric chair and any noises it was capable of making. Flora had found it to be a vaguely threatening and not at all useful issue of terrible things. That's your father, said Flora's mother. He rings that doorbell to make me feel guilty. The doorbell buzzed and crackled again. See? Said her mother. Flora didn't see. How could one person ringing a doorbell make another person feel guilty? It was ridiculous. But then, just about everything about Flora's mother said or wrote sounded faintly ridiculous to Flora. For example, on featherhead wings of joy. Since when did joy have feathered wings? Don't just stand there, Flora Belle. Go open the door. Let him in. He's your father. He's here to see you, not me. The electric chair knell at the doorbell sounded through the house again. For the love of Pete, said her mother. What's he doing? Leaning on the thing? Go get him. Go let him in. Would you? Flora walked slowly through the dining room and into the living room. She shook her head in amazement. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could lift a vacuum cleaner over his head with one paw. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could type. Holy bagoomba, thought Flora. Things are going to change around here. We're going to be vanquishing villains left and right. She smiled a very large smile. The doorbell gave another outraged sizzle. Flora was still smiling when she unlocked the door and opened it wide. End of chapter 15. Beginning of chapter 16. Sorry, let me get some more water. We're almost done here with this part anyway. Let me see. Do I want to... Oops. Yeah, let me keep... let me keep reading a couple more chapters. It was not her father at the door. Chapter 16, by the way. It was not her father at the door. It was Tootie. Tootie Tickum, said Flora. Sorry. Tootie Tickum, said Flora. Tootie stepped through the door and into the living room. And then she stopped. Her eyes widened. What in the world? She said. Flora didn't even bother turning around. She knew what Tootie was looking at. That's the little shepherdess, said Flora. The guardian of the lost sheep and light. Or something. She belongs to my mother. Right, said Tootie. She shook her head. Well, never mind about the lamp. She took another step closer to Flora. Where's the squirrel? She whispered. Upstairs. Flora whispered back. I've come to check and see if what I think happened yesterday actually happened. And if I'm the victim of an extended hallucination. Flora looked at Tootie in the eye. She said, Ulysses can type. Who can type? Said Tootie. The squirrel. He's a superhero. Tootie said, for heaven's sake, what kind of superhero types? It was a good and also slightly disturbing point. How exactly was a typing squirrel going to fight villains and change the world? George, shouted Flora's mother. It's not Pop, Flora shouted back. It's Mrs. Tickum. There was a silence from the kitchen, and then Flora's mother came into the living room with a big fake adult smile plastered on her face. Mrs. Tickum, she said, what a lovely surprise. What can we do for you? Tootie smiled a big fake adult smile back. Oh, she said, I just came to pay Flora a visit. Who? Flora, said Tootie, your daughter. Really? Said Flora's mother. You came to see Flora? I'll be right back, said Flora. She ran out of the living room and through the dining room. What a truly extraordinary lamp, she said. She heard Tootie say. Oh, do you like it? Said Flora's mother. Ha! Thought Flora. And then she was out of the dining room and into the kitchen. She ripped the paper out of the typewriter and looked down at the words. They were absolutely not a hallucination. Holy bagoomba, said Flora. A loud scream echoed through the house. Flora took up the paper and shoved it down the front of her pajamas and ran back into the living room. Ulysses was sitting on top of Marianne. Or rather, he was trying to sit on top of Marianne. His feet were scrambling to gain purchase on the little shepherdess pink flowered lampshade. He paused in his efforts and looked at Flora in an apologetic and hopeful way. And then he returned to wobbling back and forth. Oh my goodness, said Tootie. How did it get in here? Shouted Flora's mother. It just came flying down the stairs. Yes, said Tootie. She gave Flora a meaningful look. Flying. It absolutely scared the living daylights out of me and Mrs. Tickham. We screamed. We did, said Tootie. We screamed. There's just no end to the excitement. If that squirrel breaks my lamp, I don't know what I'll do. Marianne is very precious to me. Marianne? Said Tootie. I'll just get him off the lamp, okay? Said Flora. She put out a hand. Don't touch it, screamed her mother. It has a disease. The doorbell. As oops, almost forgot. Show you the picture. There's Ulysses on top of Mary Ann, the lampshade. And I think I see the little lamb down there. So he's just looking all cute, kind of looking at them like, hey guys. So he's acting a little cute. The doorbell, as if it were echoing Flora's mother's advice, buzzed its terrible warning buzz. Flora and her mother and Tootie all turned. A small voice called out. The voice said, Great Aunt Tootie? End of chapter 16. Beginning of chapter 17. After I read chapter 18 is when we'll be done for the night. I know, but we'll pick it up tomorrow. Chapter 17. There was a boy at the door. He was short, and his hair was so blonde that it looked almost white. His eyes were hidden behind enormous dark glasses. In addition to Terrible Things Can Happen to You, the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto regularly featured a second bonus comic entitled The Criminal Element is Among Us. The Criminal Element gave very specific printers on how to never, ever be fooled by a criminal. And one of the oft-repeated dictums of Criminal Element was that the best way to get to know a person was to look him or her directly in the eye. Flora tried to look the boy in the eye, but all she saw was a reflection of herself in his dark glasses. She looked short and uncertain, like an accordion in pajamas. William, said Tootie, I told you to stay put. I heard screaming, said the boy. His voice was high and thin. I was concerned. I came as fast as I could. Unfortunately, on the way over here, I heard a small but extremely violent encounter with some variety of shrub, and now I'm bleeding. I think I'm bleeding. I'm pretty sure I smell blood, but no one should be concerned. Please don't overreact. This, Tootie said, is my nephew. Great nephew, said the boy, and I hope I don't need stitches. Do you think I need stitches? His name is William, said Tootie. William Spiver, actually, said Tootie's nephew. I prefer to be called William Spiver. It distinguishes me from the multiplicity of Williams in the world. He smiled. It's a pleasure to meet you, whoever you are. I would shake your hand, but as I said, I think I'm bleeding. Also, I'm blind. You are not blind, said Tootie. I am suffering from a temporary blindness induced by trauma, said William Spiver. Temporary blindness induced by trauma. The words sent a chill down Flora's spine. Seemingly, there was no end to the things that could go wrong with human beings. Why hadn't Terrible Things Can Happen to You done an issue on temporary blindness induced by trauma? Or, for that matter, one on extended hallucinations? I am temporarily blind, said William Spiver again. How unfortunate, said Flora's mother. He's not blind, said Tootie, but as of this morning, he is staying with me for the summer. Imagine my surprise and excitement. I have nowhere else to go, great Aunt Tootie, said William Spiver. You know that. I am at the mercy of the winds of fate. Oh, said Flora's mother. She clapped her hands. How wonderful! A little friend for Flora. I don't need a little friend, said Flora. Of course you do, said her mother. She turned to Tootie. Flora is very lonely. She spends far too much time reading comics. I've tried to break her of the habit, but I'm busy with my novel writing, and she is alone a lot. I'm worried she has made her that it has made her strange. I'm not strange, said Flora. This seemed like a safe statement to make when someone as truly profoundly strange as William Spiver was standing beside her. I would be happy to be your friend, said William Spiver. Honored, he bowed. How lovely, said Flora's mother. Yes, said Flora. How lovely. The blind, said William Spiver, even the temporary blind, have an excellent sense of smell. Oh, for heaven's sake, said Tootie, here we go. I have to tell you that I smell something out of the ordinary, something that is not usually smelled within the confines of the human domestic sphere, said William Spiver. He cleared his throat. I smell squirrel. Squirrel! Confronted with the spectacle of William Spiver, they had forgotten about Ulysses. Flora and her mother and Tootie all turned and looked at Ulysses. He was still on the top of Marianne. He had managed to balance himself on the small blue and green globe that was at the center of the lampshade. That squirrel, said Flora's mother. He's rabid, diseased. He's got to go. End of chapter 17, and we'll be done with chapter 18 here for tonight, because there are 68 chapters here, and my plan is to do 10 of these chapters per night for you guys, so just to give you a heads up. We are in chapter 18. Why don't you let me take the squirrels? Tootie said to Flora's mother. I'll just return them to the wild. If you can call the backyard the wild, said William Spiver. Hush up, William, said Tootie. She reached out for Ulysses. Don't touch it, shrieked Flora's mother. Not without gloves. It has some sort of disease. If you could just get some gloves then, said Tootie, I'll pluck the squirrel off the lampshade and whisk him out of here and set him free. The kids can come along. It will be a scientific adventure. It doesn't sound very scientific to me, said William Spiver. Well, said Flora's mother, I don't know. Flora Belle's father is coming to pick her up for their Saturday visit. He'll be here any minute now, and she's still in her pajamas. Flora Belle? Said William Spiver. What a lovely, melodious name. It will all take just a minute, said Tootie in a low, soothing voice. The kids can get to know each other. I'll get you some gloves, said Flora's mother. And so now here they were, walking over to Tootie's, getting to know each other, or something. Alright, just checking. Tootie had on a pair of dishwashing gloves that went all the way around her elbows. The gloves were bright pink, and they glowed in a cherry radioactive sort of way. In Tootie's gloved hands was Ulysses. Behind Tootie was Flora. And next to Flora was William Spiver. His left hand rested on her shoulder. Do you mind, Flora Belle? He had said. Would it trouble you terribly if I put my hand on your shoulder and allowed you to guide me back to Great Aunt Tootie's house? The world is a treacherous place when you can't see. Flora didn't bother pointing out to him that the world was a treacherous place when you could see. And speaking of treacherousness, things were not in any way progressing as Flora had planned. She had envisioned Ulysses fighting crime, criminals, villainy, darkness, treachery. She had imagined him flying, holy bagoomba, through the world with her Flora Buckman at his side. Instead, here she was leading a temporarily blind boy through her own backyard. It was anticlimactic, to say the least. Have you released the squirrel yet, Great Aunt Tooty? No, no, said Tooty. I have not. Why do I sense that there is more going on here than meets the eye? Said William Spiver. Just keep quiet until we get back to the house, William, said Tooty. Can you do that? Keep quiet for a minute? Of course I can, said William Spiver. He sighed. I'm an old pro at keeping quiet. Flora doubted very much that this was true. William Spiver squeezed her shoulder. May I inquire how old you are, Florabelle? Don't squeeze my shoulder. I'm 10. I am 11 years old, said William Spiver, which surprises me. I must say, I feel much older than 11. Also, I know for a fact that I'm smaller than your average 11-year-old. It may even be that I'm shrinking. Excessive trauma can retard growth. I'm not certain. However, if it can cause actual shrinkage. What was the traumatic event that turned you blind? Said Flora. I prefer not to discuss it right now. I don't want to alarm you. It's not possible to alarm me, said Flora. I'm a cynic. Nothing in human nature surprises a cynic. So you say, said William Spiver. The word cryptic popped into Flora's head. It was preceded by the word unnecessarily. Unnecessarily cryptic, said Flora out loud. I beg your pardon, said William Spiver. But then they were at Tooty's house. They were walking through her backyard and into her kitchen, which smelled like bacon and lemons. Tooty put Ulysses down on the table. I don't understand, said William Spiver. We're back at your house, but I can still smell the squirrel. Flora, Flora took the paper out of her pajamas. She handed it to Tooty. She felt like a spy. A successful spy. A triumphant spy. Albeit a spy in pajamas. What's this? Said Tooty. It's proof that you aren't the victim of an extended hallucination, said Flora. Tooty held the paper with both hands. She stared at it. Squirrel, she said. Squirrel? Said William Spiver. Keep reading, said Flora. Squirrel, said Tooty. I am Ulysses, born anew. See? Said Flora. What does that prove? Said William Spiver. What does it even mean? The squirrel's name is Ulysses, said Tooty. Wait a minute, said William Spiver. Are you positing? Are you positing that the squirrel typed those words? Positing? Positing? Yes, said Flora. That's exactly what I'm positing. The hallucination extends, said Tooty. What hallucination? Said William Spiver. The squirrel as a superhero hallucination, said Tooty. Surely you jest, said William Spiver. Ulysses sat up on his hind legs. He looked at William Spiver, then at Tooty, and finally he turned his eyes to Flora. He raised his eyebrows and gave her a look full of questions, full of hope. Flora felt a pang of doubt. He was, after all, just a squirrel. He had no proof that he was a superhero. What if there was some other explanation for those words? Also, there was Tooty's disturbing point to consider. What kind of superhero types? And then she thought about Alfred. How everyone doubted him. How no one, except the parakeet Dolores, knew that he was incandesto, and how no one, except Dolores, truly believed in him. Was it Flora's job to believe in Ulysses? And what did that make her, a parakeet? Let me get this straight, said William Spiver. You, a self-professed cynic, are positing that the squirrel is a superhero. The words do not hope. Instead, observe fitted through Flora's brain. She took a deep breath. She brushed the phrase away. The squirrel typed those words, she said. Well, said William Spiver, whose hand was still on Flora's shoulder. Why didn't he move his hand? Let's just approach this scientifically. We'll put the squirrel in front of Aunt Tootie's computer, and we'll ask him to type again. End of chapter 18. We're currently at chapter 19. I do not have a bookmark. I do not have a bookmarker with me, but I'll use this temporarily. It's a receipt, but that's okay. Receipts are still good. We still use receipts for stuff like bookmarkers. So, anywho, look at all that reading we did tonight. We read 18 chapters tonight, which is crazy. But as much as I would like to get to, there's another book I'm reading, but right now I won't be able to get to it till maybe tomorrow morning. But for right now, we're going to be doing this nightly, and then the other one we'll do daily during the day. So I hope you all enjoyed this book. This is my first kids book that I'm reading to you guys. So I'm hoping you guys are enjoying it. We'll enjoy this part, and we'll bring up another one in the near future, maybe tomorrow night. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next video. Until then, I am the Loyal Hufflepuff. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe down below. And if you have any comments about this book, or you have an interest in, or you have a comment about comparing this book to the movie, please comment down below. I would love to hear from you guys. Until then, I'm the Loyal Hufflepuff, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.